Hello. All right, I think we can get started. I'm sure more people will be joining, but they'll trickle in. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Hannah Groch Begley. I am Managing Director of the Roosevelt Institute's think tank. For those of you who haven't joined us at a book club before, we are always thrilled to welcome authors who've written books that help us understand aspects of the Rooseveltian worldview and offer new insights for our research. The way that these work is that we will start by hearing from our guest author, who will tell us a little bit about the book and why they wrote it. I'll then have some prepared questions to kick our conversation off, and then we'll open things up for audience questions towards the end of the hour. At any point during our conversation, if you come up with a question and you want to just put it in the chat, you can. And then when we get to that audience Q&A portion, I'm happy to read it out and grab it. Or you can wait and when we open up the Q&A, you can come off mute and ask your question directly. It's totally up to you. So today I am absolutely thrilled to welcome historian Kathleen Frydl, who has written a fabulously rich book for us to dive into. So Kathleen, I will turn it over to you to tell us about liberalism and the reinvention of the modern corporation.
Thank you, Hannah. And thanks to everyone joining this afternoon. I want to begin this talk by posing the question of why it is in the United States during truly emancipatory moments, why do corporations come out as the real winners? And by that, I mean, how are corporate advocates able to position themselves as the beneficiaries of instruments that were actually designed for people far less powerful? And I'm going to try to convince you that this happens twice. The first time it happens is a straightforward and very well-known story. It's a well-known story to students of American history. The second time it happens is my story. It's the story of the book I just published. And in a sense, that's my argument that this has happened not just once, but twice in American history. I want to start by cloaking the phrase emancipatory moment in a little bit more formal or historical language. And I'm going to use the phrase modern liberalism. And modern liberalism essentially has two components. It's first a project of individual freedom, particularly securing access to freedoms previously excluded, that they were previously excluded from enjoying. And the second component is a project of public welfare or some kind of pursuit of the collective good. In the United States, the first wave of modern liberalism starts in the states and eventually moves to the federal government. And in fact, it culminates in the New Deal. So the New Deal is kind of the end point of the first wave of modern liberalism. But it's launched immediately following the Civil War. And that's where our story begins. And that's the first round of corporations capitalizing on an emancipatory moment or the first wave of modern liberalism. And it's to do with the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed following the Civil War and ratified in 1868. Now, the amendment was designed and written to deliver the bounties of freedom to freed men and freed women, particularly those who still lived in the states of the former Confederacy. But in a series of cases following the Civil War, the Supreme Court drastically limited the actors and ultimately the actions that might be targeted by the amendment's guarantees of due process and equal protection. During the same interval of time, however, the Supreme Court also developed a really expansive reading of the 14th Amendment as it regarded corporations. And that story had to do with the individual states' efforts to regulate railroads, which were the kind of tech titans or really powerful corporations of their day. In those cases, the Supreme Court puts forward access to the 14th Amendment guarantees of due process and equal protection on behalf of corporations. And I say puts forward because it's really wrong to say that the Supreme Court actually decided it. It's a story filled with intrigue, and it's a story that's preoccupied generations of students of the law and legal historians. But in short terms, it's put forward in a head note to a case called Santa Clara and then accepted as though the Supreme Court had actually decided rather than elided over the question of how it is that corporations can access the 14th Amendment. In any event, the key actor in the first corporate reinvention is the federal judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court. And the tool is certain readings of the 14th Amendment. It's a very clear story with very easily identified actors and very easily identified tools. Not so with my story. So the second round or the second reinvention of the corporate entity is linked to the second wave of modern liberalism. In the era following World War II, when the New Deal did not address itself to all problems or reach all people, there was a new campaign or pursuit of individual freedom most famously on behalf of the Black freedom movement, which challenged de jure and de facto segregation. And many social movements patterned themselves after this paradigmatic social movement. And in fact, many social movements benefited from the legislation and the precedents that were won by the Black freedom movement in the post-World War II era. And many people think of second wave liberalism solely in terms of social movements. But actually, it was also an era of profound state building, which is a term of art that's used to describe the policies and the institutions of government. So many of our listeners will know that in 1964, the government passes Medicare. But in addition to that, and in fact signed by Republican presidents and passed by bipartisan majorities in Congress, in the second wave of liberalism, we also see really serious regulation of industry, like the Clean Air Act and its subsequent amendments and sister legislation, the Clean Water Act, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And in the wake of Watergate, we see the first regime of meaningful campaign finance regulation. So in 3 different sections of my book, I tell 3 different stories of what I call corporate identity politics, which is how I characterize the second reinvention of the corporation. And all of these sections are in conversation with different aspects of second wave liberalism. But I argue it's the same dynamic as the 14th Amendment story. That is to say, the tools furnished by the pursuit of individual freedom, in this case, the social movements, were wielded by corporate advocates to undermine the pursuit of the collective good, in this case, the regulation of industry. So I'm going to tell the story of the first 2 chapters a little bit more closely, and then I'll give Cliff Note versions of the other 2 campaigns. In the first 2 chapters, I tell the story of how it is that as women sought reproductive autonomy, in this case, abortion and tubal ligation, that care clashed with the prevailing ethical directives of Catholic hospitals. And in the contest between women and Catholic hospitals looking to claim maximum autonomy, women came out less free, and hospitals emerged as more religious. And now, in telling the story of how that happened, it's time to reveal the main character of the book. And it's not the federal judiciary in my story, it's the United States Congress. And you might be able, I don't know how well this will come out, but you might be able to see the US Capitol kind of hidden, and it's hidden there on purpose in the handshake of the reinvention of the modern corporation. So I argue that the key actor here is Congress, and the tool that they use is not the 14th Amendment or anything like that. It's what I call the quiet powers of Congress. And I'm going to give an example of that as it relates to the women reproductive autonomy Catholic hospital story. So what did Congress do? Well, following Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision, Congress passed the Church Amendment, which is the first of the so-called federal conscience clauses that kind of picked a winner and loser in the fight for greater autonomy between women and hospitals. And the Church Amendment said nothing about the receipt of public funds requires recognition of a woman's right of abortion or sterilization. But the story doesn't end there, because there was nothing to prevent women from challenging that language in court, which in fact is what the civil rights movement did. In an extraordinary move, Congress also stripped courts of jurisdiction over this very question. So when the Conscience Clause moved from the Senate to the House lawmakers added any court to any public official as among those who were enjoined from requiring recognition of a woman's right to abortion or sterilization as a condition for the receipt of public funds. And in fact, there was a case that pitted women's reproductive autonomy, in this case, tubal ligation, against a Catholic hospital that the hospital was well on its way to losing, but for the court stripping of the Church Amendment. So court stripping gave these nonprofit charities, Catholic hospitals, a more religious cast. And this supercharged religious identity was a useful shield against the numerous efforts to tax and to regulate nonprofit hospitals, leading one Catholic hospital official to remark that from the standpoint of institutional autonomy, the abortion issue was, quote, a blessing in disguise. And so that's the pattern. And I put it in motion in two other sections, and I'll kind of give Cliff Notes versions of those sections. The middle two chapters deal with public welfare offenses, specifically nonviolent drug offenses and corporate regulatory violations. And the Cliff Notes version of this story is that in the effort to reform criminal justice, nonviolent drug offenders came out as more harshly punished, and corporations came out as far less so. And this story centers on what I regard as kind of a forgotten chapter in the history of mass incarceration, and that is the effort to pass a federal criminal code. In the various campaigns to pass a federal criminal code in the late 1970s, representatives from corporate America cited the recommendations of a reform-minded commission, the Brown Commission, that did not apply to corporate crime and ignored those that did. So what is it that Congress did in this instance? Well, Congress says, we're going to talk about these things as different. We're going to talk about nonviolent drug offenses and corporate regulatory violations as extremely different, even though we know they're both public welfare offenses. They're both anchored in the Commerce Clause, so we use similar powers to regulate them both, and they've been treated similarly throughout the recent past, from the turn of the 20th century onward. So at the height of liberal reform, legislators totally abandoned the effort to pass a federal criminal code that stipulated uniform definitions of intent. And they opted instead for a sentencing regime, literally a sentencing act, that had dramatically different punishments for similar mindsets. And finally, in the last two chapters of the book, substantive chapters, I discuss corporate political speech. And the Cliff Notes version of that story is that in the effort to pass legislation, and craft regulations to control the effect of concentrated wealth on elections, labor unions emerged with a constitutional right to political speech, but also with burdens of disclosure and consent, while corporations emerged with those same rights, but without any of the same burdens. So prior to Watergate, corporate political donors passed money under the table as Congress investigated and created an infrastructure really to monitor the political speech of organized labor. Following the campaign finance regulations that were passed in the wake of the Watergate scandal, corporations took advantage of the course charted by unions, specifically the jurisprudence and the regulations enabling political action committees, without enduring any similar scrutiny of their own internal affairs. So, what did Congress do in this particular instance? Congress says, we're going to talk about these two things, union speech and corporate political speech, as though they're on the same footing, even though we know they are different. So Congress imposed a level of political regulation and scrutiny on unions more rigorous than that required of corporations, even though far more and far more significant political corruption could be traced back to the boardroom and not the union hall. So in closing out these introductory remarks, I want to flag a couple of things about my argument. The first is that the second round of reinvention cannot be captured solely by discussing corporate personhood. Sometimes corporate advocates rely on personhood or a conception of corporate personhood, and sometimes they rely on the exact opposite. There's a very expedient relationship among corporate advocates when it comes to the conceptualization of corporate identity. Another thing I want to flag is how important it is, I think, to provide a periodization of the business assault on modern liberalism. The assault on liberalism is shaped by liberalism itself. And just as there are several iterations of modern liberalism, likewise, there are several iterations of the business response to it. And to my mind, the second round, the second assault on second wave liberalism, which is centered on what I call corporate identity politics, shapes and describes the modern conservative movement far more than the first round, the first assault on modern liberalism, which is really anchored in the promotion of free market ideology. Finally, I want to answer the question that I myself posed, which is how is it that corporations emerge as the winners? And I want to draw from an observation made by Richard John, who is a business historian. And he says that the United States is the only major power where big business preceded big government. And from that observation, I argue that liberalism developed in a setting where big business set the terms. And from that, I myself am extremely wary of appeals to fair play or seemingly neutral language or even proceduralist thinking that do not factor in and are not even explicit about actual differences in power. So with that, that's my overview and introduction to the book. And I'd like to turn it over to Hannah for any questions she has.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. So I think as that introduction gives everyone an insight into this is an incredibly rich text. This is a book where you are grappling with a lot of history and a lot of different kinds of history, legal history, political history, as you say. Your really key contribution is to say we're not looking enough at Congress when we tell the story, but you're also doing business history. And I just want to emphasize, part of what I really enjoyed about this book is that you're destabilizing a lot of categories that I think we often think of as sort of firmly one thing or another, right? You're sort of asking us to think about nonprofits in a corporate conversation that we might not normally think of those two things as being part of one conversation. You're asking us to think about liberalism as multiple different things and as changing. And so I actually, there's a million things we could talk about. There's a million places we could start. But I wonder, maybe let's just start with liberalism. Your title, your book starts with liberalism. So let's start there. You gave us at the top, you said you're defining modern liberalism as sort of two things. It's this individual freedoms and expanding the access to individual freedoms, and then um, the drive for the public welfare, the pursuit of some kind of collective good. And your book sort of plays with this key tension where, on the one hand, you're telling a story of Congress kind of betraying the promise of modern liberalism and stripping away that focus on power inequities that you closed by mentioning. But on the other hand, you're also noticing and bringing to light that there are some things about liberalism itself, some things that are innate to it that kind of are weaknesses that left it open for this kind of
Mm,
stripping away. And in fact, that last piece you said where, sort of the US is a place in which big business always comes first, makes me think like, is part of the problem that liberalism itself is an ideology that has been built in a system that
mhm.
privileges big business. So maybe we can start there and you can sort of elaborate a little bit more on that tension and why you see
Yeah.
these innate qualities of liberalism that are sometimes inadvertently enabling corporate power.
Yeah, I noticed in the chat, and I hope we circle back. I noticed that Nelson has a correction for me already on who it is that first said that big business preceded big government. And I appreciate that. So I hope we can circle back to him specifically. So I guess to address Nelson right off the bat, the observation is to me important because I'm making a developmental and not an ideological argument. So there are many ideological arguments about liberalism. Marx famously had a critique of liberalism that it was just a mask for class domination. And this is, Hannah, I'm hoping to answer your question here. And I'm not making an argument like that. I don't think I dislodge that argument, but I'm not making that argument. I'm making a developmental argument. That is because this happened first, that shaped the terrain and the possibilities and constrained some and enhanced others. And one of the things, and again, I'm hoping to answer your question here, Hannah. One of the things that has dogged liberalism in the American setting, because of course liberalism is, a transcontinental philosophy, you know, part and parcel of the Enlightenment, et cetera. One of the things that has dogged liberalism in the American setting is a reputation for being only preoccupied with procedural fairness um, and not in any way oriented towards securing the collective good. Now, I go out of my way in the introduction to citing some, I think, authoritative folks like Dan Rogers or Roger Smith, who say, in fact, in the American setting, liberalism was always concerned with the collective good. There was always that component. What's so strange about in the United States is at first that was secured in a local setting, often through private charities, and the regulation of industry took place and corporations took place most often early on through the judiciary. Many of the historians who are online will know Bill Novak's kind of landmark work. Um, and it sounds innocuous to graduate the responsibilities for collective regulation and securing the collective good. It sounds innocuous to graduate that from local to state government and state to federal, and to transfer the responsibilities from the judiciary to the legislative domain. But in fact, these were highly contested questions, like all along the path. Um, and so I'm making a developmental, not an ideological argument. I don't believe that the fatal flaw of liberalism is that its infirmities are made manifest. I do believe that we have to work to make its commitment to the collective good more visible, and more politically salient. So I think you mentioned the ACLU. The ACLU plays a role in, let's see, two of the couplets that I outlined. Um, Probably a lot of people who are online will know that the ACLU filed a brief in favor of corporations in the Citizens United case, that legacy extends back decades, right? But many of you may not know that the ACLU was on the front lines when it came to defeating the federal criminal code. And so there is a history of those organizations, and the ACLU has subsequently recanted this and said, no, in fact, we have to be more attuned to power. But those organizations with a commitment to purely procedural fairness um, can be exploited or used to benefit this co-optation that I'm talking about. I hope that answered at least some of what you raised, Hannah.
Absolutely, absolutely it does. And yeah, I mean, like we said at the beginning, this conversation can go in so many fascinating directions, and we'll only be able to touch on some of them here. But I will just note for everyone that the link to purchase the book is in the chat, and also Oxford has released just the first chapter or the introduction online, and so you can also just read that to dive in more. But we have lots more to talk about. So I guess maybe, and we will absolutely circle back to make sure that we address everything that is coming up in the chat. But that was very helpful in sort of placing us with liberalism. So let's move to corporations, right? Like let's the building blocks of this argument.
Yes.
Um, I think. Well, perhaps what I'll ask first is that I think most people wouldn't immediately think of the Catholic Church or nonprofits as corporate actors or central to a story about corporate power. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that particular example. You already gave us a little bit of context in your introduction to help us understand that move you're making. And I think that will then also help us see the story you're telling about corporations kind of hijacking some of the social justice movements of the 20th
Yeah.
century towards their aims.
Yeah. I can't see the chat in its entirety, but I'm seeing individual comments, and boy, oh boy, you guys are really capturing my attention here. So I'm focused on answering Hannah's question, but believe me, I'm seeing what you're saying, and it's very interesting. And I thank you. So it won't surprise any historian of early America that I included nonprofits and specifically a religious corporation in my canon of corporations. Because in fact, those kinds of corporations, nonprofit charitable corporations, preceded business corporations as a form in the United States. And when the judiciary was trying to grapple with, okay, now we have folks who are incorporated to make profit, when they grappled with how to handle those entities, they drew from precedents that were set by religious corporations or nonprofit corporations. So from the beginning, like that history is very intimately bound. And we've lost that, I think. And actually, I think we would do really well to regain that. I hope my book is a step in that direction, but believe me, it's only a step. In other words, I think there's a lot more leverage we could gain from looking at corporations more expansively, including nonprofits, including religious corporations. But in any event, the answer to this question, I love this question. So rarely do we treat the Catholic Church in the United States as an institution with institutional interest and power. And I do it. And I hope others join me because I find it really clarifying, including in our current moment. The church was not just a huge proponent, but also a huge beneficiary and supporter of first wave liberalism, so that New Deal liberalism. And I actually argue that there's a wave of voluntarism that we have ignored. Typically, historians of voluntarism or private charity doing the work of social work, social policy work, will end it with the New Deal and will say, that's when the federal government came in, the curtain comes down. And they're like Elizabeth Clemens is great about saying actually no. And I'm joining in saying actually really no, that there is a history of the nonprofit sector to be told post World War II, where these nonprofits are serving as an essential partner to government. Now, part of how that happened, I mean, this makes sense, right? If we step back, the 14th Amendment is such a big deal in our history because voluntarism is such a big deal in our history. We have so many nonprofits doing the work of what is elsewhere the government. So, of course, we would come in with some sort of rules of the road, like you must serve and recognize the constitutional rights of so and so and so. Like it makes total sense from a developmental perspective. So, what I wind up arguing in the book is that the church is again a beneficiary and constituent of first wave liberalism and an antagonist to second wave liberalism of both kinds, not just the social movement kind, the state building kind. That is, it does not want greater regulation of its hospitals and et cetera, right? So they are, in a sense, charter members of the second wave assault on modern liberalism as I see it. It's just such an interesting story, and we see um, different popes, different waves of the US Conference of Catholic Bishops emphasizing one or another aspect of, okay, no, we're committed to first wave liberalism. Okay, no, we're committed to the assault on second wave liberalism. But for the church, there's no contradiction there, right? There's that's that is their developmental history. Um, so yeah, I really got a lot out of telling that story. And I think even if people aren't interested in hospitals, I hope that people will start to regard, especially the Catholic Church, from a more institutional and developmental perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I want to turn now, and again, I feel like we're touching on a lot of different things to give people a taste of everything this book goes on to. But I feel like we could talk for an hour just about the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So I want to acknowledge that. But let's talk a little bit, and you raised this in your introduction about Congress and about how important Congress is to your story and to the intervention you're making. In sort of saying the story as it has previously been told is focused almost exclusively on the courts, and you think Congress is playing a really important role here. Um, I'm, I'm interested in a lot of different things. I'm interested in why you think Congress's role in the story is previously ignored or not, focused on. But I'm also interested in hearing a little bit more about why you think Congress acted the way it did and what you think they should have done differently,
Yeah.
would have done differently. And I think that might also start to get at some of the questions that have come up in the chat so far. But yeah, like tell us a little bit about Congress's role in your story and what are alternate paths we could have gone down?
Yeah, I haven't written a book yet where Congress isn't the major story. So that's almost a hardwired disposition on my part. And in fact, if I could sum up, there might be several arguments I would advance to sum up my career as a political historian, but Congress would be one of them. Just, okay, let's think about Congress. And I like to think of it as I borrow the language of my mentor, Barry Carl, who used the phrase an uneasy state. And I like to think of Congress as the broker in an uneasy state. And there have been generations now of historians, not just mine, but a subsequent generation, that have told a story of American political development that is focused on we don't have a weak state, we have an uneven state. And what I find is Congress is a broker in that as well, right? So I have not written a book that doesn't emphasize the centrality of Congress. So I think everybody should bear that in mind. That's just something I'm always going to say. But in this particular case, when we think about modern liberalism, it's not exclusively a story of the presidency, but it's a story that's impossible without the presidency. Presidents can build and they can be bold. Likewise, Congress is not necessarily the only component to a business assault on modern liberalism, but there are certain features that it has, including, as I say, these quiet powers, the ability to act over a long tenure, over beyond the lifetime, beyond the memory, the living memory of a certain issue, right? So we start to try to pass a federal criminal code in earnest 1973. That effort doesn't die until we pass the Sentencing Act in 1984. That's several Congresses, and different chairs have changed hands in different directions, right? And the country itself has become preoccupied with many different issues. Point being, there is a kind of seniority effect, if you will, of Congress that just by hanging in over the long term, corporations can secure an advantage in Congress through multiple paths. Congress can act, it can refrain from acting. Congress can be loud, Congress can be quiet, right? There are certain institutional features of Congress that I think lend itself to corporate advocacy. And hopefully I feature those in each of the stories. So, for example, I mentioned briefly, but I'll say it, that during the discussions of the Landrum-Griffin Act in the 1950s, which is a crucial component to how union political speech is regulated, you do have witnesses come and say, you could say the same thing about corporations, right? Andrew Hacker appears before the committee and say, all of these issues that we're discussing about unions apply to corporations as well. And yet the chair of the committee, McClellan, just ignores that. I can see Nelson smirking. Like, of course he ignored that. I can see it out of the and yes, right. And McClellan, interestingly, plays a role in several of the stories, not just the political speech, but the federal criminal code story as well. So, you know, there are certain congressional representatives, McClellan and I would say Strom Thurmond, that play a role in this story, but I would even go away from the main character energy. I would just say it's more so the multiple avenues and quiet powers that Congress has tend to lend itself to corporate advocacy.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the ability to play the long game, which sort of both of those formations have, is going to always win out. Um, we're somehow it's already 2:37, and so I wanna get on a couple more things before we open up the Q&A. So you end the book by suggesting that corporations may actually be losing ground a
Yeah.
little bit by accumulating these rights, and by sort of the story you're telling is not over yet, and that you're actually seeing some changes. Can you explain that a little bit to us?
Yeah. Yeah. I I try not to be impish, but sometimes I give myself away. And that phrase is a phrase Charles Murray applied to social movements of the second wave, that they were losing ground. Um, and specifically that the war on poverty did not do any service to people who were impoverished. And that work has a work of social science, but it's gained a fair amount of notoriety for the absence of social science, like the absence of empirical evidence in it. So I kind of turn that phrase and apply it to the backlash against second wave liberalism. And that is, yes, corporations secured a short-term advantage by personalizing aspects of the corporate entity. And that's what I mean when I talk about corporate identity politics, that they successfully personalized aspects of corporate identity, whether that was acquiring religious attributes or accessing leniency or accessing speech without any burdens of disclosure, consent, whatever. So I draw a circle around those and say, but in the long term, has that actually served the interest of business enterprise? Because exactly these feel, right? Exactly when it comes to the standard of care for ordinary Americans, exactly when it comes to the regulation, particularly the environmental regulation or workplace safety, and the way in which our elections are run as spectacles of wealth, exactly these dimensions upon which the corporation sees ground are those dimensions which we most glaringly trail our peer countries. And I find that provocative. Now, this is something that is in the conclusion of the book, and I think it would be fair to say that, you know, others can and should explore this more. But I was happy just to raise the connection and point to the possibility that corporations writ large, business enterprise writ large, have lost ground by securing these advantages. I wonder whether they've worked in the long term, because after all, ordinary Americans don't really benefit from a high standard of healthcare as compared to our peer countries. And after all, ordinary Americans don't really benefit from safe and healthy communities compared to our peer countries. And after all, ordinary Americans don't really participate in elections that successfully regulate the effects of concentrated wealth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the points that you make really compellingly in the book is that, a lot of this backlash is coming as Americans are very clearly in support of campaign finance regulation, clean air regulation. Like those things are wildly popular. And that is why, in a what sense, there has to be this uh quiet movement against those things because they know they're up against something that's quite popular. So I think that's really a helpful frame for us to think through. I do want to open things up for audience Q&A. We've already got some great things in the chat, which we can start with, but please feel free to put more questions in the chat or to raise your hand on Zoom, and I will then call on you so you can speak off mute. So let's start in the chat. Beverly Moran, Roosevelt Senior Fellow, asks, and she asked this while you were talking about Congress and sort of like why are they choosing corporations? Why is big business winning? And we talked a little bit about that, but are there other aspects like just a different kind of lobbying effort? Bribery, over-identification with the wealthy? Are there other things about Congress that made
Mm.
them more like in tune with the corporate good rather than the social good that you're identifying here? And Beverly, if I mischaracterize that question, please clarify for us.
Um, so hopefully some of what I said has already addressed
Yes.
that. I love this idea of like of congressional representatives over identifying with corporate interests. I think it's impossible to separate um, the success that corporate advocates enjoy in Congress from the failure of campaign finance reform. And that's a story. I basically tell a revisionist story of Watergate. Most political historians, 99.9% of political historians tell the story of Watergate as a story about Richard Nixon and abuse of power. And far be it from me to deny any of those aspects to the story, but this 0.01% political historian tells the story of Watergate as just the latest chapter in a long series of corporate corruption scandals. And when it's placed in that light, and in particular, for those of you who are very familiar with this history, when we pay attention to the second report of the special prosecutor, which detailed all of the corporate corruption, and actually gave unions a clean bill of health. They looked and did not find any union corruption in the 1972 campaign. Um, then it becomes clear that the real failure of campaign finance reform was to apply any of it to Congress at all. There were proposals, and those proposals failed. And they failed specifically in the House, which during the time period I discuss was the chamber that was far more disposed towards corporate interests. And I would say is still uh, today. Um, and I think that is because of the 2 year election cycle and the constant need to, and the expense of our elections, right? So um, there's a bit of a chicken egg here because once these failures happen, they're that much more difficult to overcome. In a world of corporate PACs, it's that much more difficult to secure campaign finance legislation and so on and so on. And so there's something like what a political scientist would call path dependency, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And one area that we probably won't have time to get into, but just thinking about like how might we disentangle this relationship? How might we change things? And it does seem like that campaign finance piece feels to me like a really primary, like the first thing you have to tackle before a lot of other opportunities come up. But going back to the chat, let's see, Nelson has left a couple of different comments and then asks, how does your argument fit with or not the idea that corporations have fissured so many functions and responsibilities? And of course, Nelson, if you want to elaborate, feel free to come off mute.
Nelson, I'll mute myself.
Do you want me to say something? Hello. Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, Wilde's book, the fissuring and this disaggregation of the corporation, and in many ways, this is the way to corporations to elide or escape various kinds of regulatory structures, and they're doing it extremely well. Uber, Lyft, franchising, you name it. It's uh, and then also supply chain. So you can have you can pass an excellent law, but it would only apply to a small segment of the economic activity that the corporation does, or it would foist onto players who don't have resources, like in terms of franchising, the responsibility. And then not just a question of labor and collective bargaining. It's a whole variety of things. So that anyway, I'll stop.
Thank you, Nelson. I think that in to the extent that the book relates to any of that, it's a sort of delineation of the status quo ante, like the the state of play. And so it's deeper even that corporations will adapt competitively to regulation. It's that they'll adapt competitively to liberalism itself. Um, and Hannah mentioned it quickly. I don't see any path that gets us through without returning to the bipartisan consensus of second wave regulation. Um, and that's more a belief. I mean, I think it's logical, but it's a belief that those pieces of regulation, and Hannah, thank you for bringing this up because I didn't do it in my introductory remarks, that part of the reason why corporations adapted to second wave liberalism by personalizing aspects of their identity was to, okay, evade those regulations, but also to not do it explicitly, right? Because those regulations were extremely popular. So I say in the book, I think it's in the introduction, that corporate advocates were on the one hand looking to make an argument, but on the other hand looking to avoid one. And it's that avoid part. I don't see any path through the fissuring or the successful evasion of regulation, no matter how you write it, until we return back to the status quo ante, back to that bipartisan consensus, and back to being explicit about it. That's a belief answer. It's logical, but that's a belief answer as much as anything else.
Totally fair and very, very interesting. I think particularly in this new age of AI and I think there's lots of new interest in returning to conversations around regulation, and I wonder if some of those conversations can happen in a way that haven't we haven't been able to have them successfully. But
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can I
please,
piggyback on that real
of
quick? Because
course.
we haven't brought this up and I haven't brought it up. But one thing that I do advocate for in the conclusion of the book is the federal chartering of corporations. And that also, Nelson, might go to some way to answering your question as well. Um, and mine of like, how do we return to this status quo ante? Federal chartering of interstate corporations. It's an idea that was floated in the New Deal. It was an idea that was floated in the second wave of liberalism. We've lost it. I think we should pick it up again.
Yeah, and I will put a note that Roosevelt has actually written some papers advocating for exactly that. So people should feel free to check out some of our ideas on the topic. Back to the chat, we have a question from Stephen Amberg. Congress did pass campaign finance reform, but the Supreme Court has continually undermined it. Could you discuss this and the benefits to wealthy donors? Could Congress address this? And I think this also gets at, you're bringing Congress into the story, but the court is still very much a part of this story.
Yes. And particularly in the campaign finance story. And thank you, Stephen. That part, I said it inartfully. And that is what Congress did was extract itself from campaign finance reform in the final version of FICA 2, which is what we're talking about here. But for those of us who think, oh, Citizens United, that's really the point of origin and the root of all of this, then it's the Roberts Court. Let me tell you something. There's another case, and Stephen, I bet, knows it, called Buckley v. Vallejo that we should all be really, really concerned about. And that's a case I discuss to great extent. And Stephen's perfectly right that FICA too was a credible regime. It was credible campaign finance reform as it applied to the presidency and as it applied to fundraising for the Congress as well. But Congress overturned, the Supreme Court overturned campaign expenditures, which is money spent on electioneering that's not under the direct control of the candidate, and they overturned it as a form of speech. And that's a case that I look very carefully at, Stephen, because Congress, to my way of thinking, the Supreme Court recognizes a constitutional right to political speech for unions and for corporations in Buckley v. Vallejo, but they do it by adopting a constitutional standard review. So they don't do it explicitly. It's not something that they deliberate on in text, but they adopt a constitutional standard of review that applies to individuals, for unions, and for organized political speech for corporations as well. And so I think it's perfectly fair to point to Buckley v. Vallejo, and there's an iterative process with campaign finance in particular that takes place between Congress and the Supreme Court. Specifically, what Congress takes off the table for itself is public funding, and that is something that is only applied to the executive. I hope that clarifies, and I'm sure I said that inartfully. But no one should discount the importance of the Supreme Court when it comes to political speech. It's interesting that in Bellotti, when the First Amendment rights of corporations to political speech is explicitly discussed and recognized, the SEC actually has some internal memos and some bulletins that they publish, and I discuss these in the book, that say, gosh, maybe we should pass some regulations on corporate governance that conform to the assumptions made in Bellotti. And of course, they never do. So it's not just even an iterative process between Congress and the courts. There's also regulatory bodies like the SEC that are in play in that story as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Happy to take more questions. While we wait for more questions to come in, I'll ask one of my own. I always have more questions. I'm, always interested in the sort of behind the scenes process of how books like this get written. And so, one question on that is, if there's something that surprised you, or what was genuinely challenging and complicated some of your initial assumptions when you went into writing this book.
Yeah, I went into this book by telling the Catholic hospital story, and what surprised me was the regulations in the background. So the surprising extent, I mean, people think about universal healthcare and securing universal healthcare and Truman, and of course Bill Clinton, and now we have the ACA. There was a moment in the 1970s where there was a lot of healthcare reform under discussion, and the movement was really thrusting. I can remember reading things in the Catholic Hospital Association that were, predictions of universal healthcare within years, right? And so there's a lot of state building activity in the 1970s. Boy, oh boy. And so then when I started to think through some of these other issues, it seemed to me the regulations were always in the background. So for example, in the federal criminal code discussions, that's a difficult road in the Senate, and it takes them many years. But eventually the Senate does pass, and it's the only body to pass a federal criminal code. And it gets booted over to the House, and boy, oh boy, you've got these new organizations like the Business Roundtable that leap into action and become stalwart opponents of the federal criminal code. So it was just the regulatory aspect of the story that surprised me. I expected to write a history of corporate personhood. That's how I thought this was going to go. And then it turned out, in fact, no, corporate advocates rely on corporate personhood and don't rely on it. It's an extremely expedient relationship to the corporate entity. So that kind of fell by the wayside, and it was more so the story of the regulations and the role that the regulations played in forging and reinventing the corporation. And that's when, of course, brought me to mind Like any political historian, any American political historian would be like, this rhymes with the 14th Amendment stuff. Boy, oh boy, And so that's when I thought, I've got I've got hold of something here. And people can call it different things. You can call it corporate identity politics or something, but there's something, I've drawn a circle around something. So that's what surprised me most was how prominently the state building aspect of second wave liberalism featured in the various components of these stories. Yeah,
Thank you. That's really helpful. I guess just to close us out, you mentioned briefly at the beginning that in providing us with this second wave moment of the history that goes beyond the 14th Amendment and helps us sort of see how the post-war moment is playing a new role. That you mentioned that you think that that helps explain modern conservatism better
yeah,
than
yeah,
maybe our previous narratives have done. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that and
yeah,
what you see in modern conservatism today that you think is so intrinsically tied to this history you're telling?
yeah. Let me also go back to what you said about the Roosevelt Institute has papers on federal charter. There are probably academics listening to this. I also think, in addition to, okay, federal charters, maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, but progressives, by and large, since the legal realists have abandoned the project of conceptualizing the corporate entity, we need to return to it. The strictly behavioral regulation of corporations has not worked. Corporations will respond, competitively adapt to regulations and to, as I say, liberalism itself. And so I would call for a return to conceptualizing the corporate identity. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I just wanted to circle back and say that. So I, when we think about the important works that have contributed to our understanding of the modern conservative movement, and particularly the business assault on liberalism, they speak about it as if it's one thing launched during the New Deal, and it has certain actors and think tanks behind it, and a certain ideology, and that's free market ideology. When I look at the world today, I don't see free market ideology animating a lot of modern conservatives, even though some of those institutions exist. And I would be the last person to deny the influence of several of the important funders and so on and so forth. I think more so the reinvention of the corporate entity, the second reinvention, is I call it a marriage between the business assault on regulation and the cultural assault on social progress. I think that describes more. And in fact, there's an organizational embodiment of this marriage, and it's right down the street from me. It's called the Heritage Foundation. And I speak about the Heritage Foundation in all of these couplets. They play a role in all of these couplets. And so what I'm essentially saying is, um, however historically important the promotion of a free market ideology, and of course we can talk about how much that described reality, but the promotion of a free market ideology, however important we think that is, I would argue what describes more of the conservative movement and what animates the modern conservative movement um, is the second reinvention of the modern corporation. Doctrines like religious liberty, which yoke together important institutional interests like Catholic hospitals to modern evangelical. A lot of a lot of the different components of the modern conservative coalition, which are may not be consistent with each other, can find common ground on the second reinvention of the corporate identity. So that's, I just want to return to this thought. I think it's really worth it to periodize the business assault on modern liberalism. I think we gain a lot by doing so, including descriptively, we gain a lot.
Absolutely, thank you. And as someone who's trained as a historian, I completely agree. I think that this is really a book where the history itself, I think you even say like the history itself is the argument you're making, and that like by showing these things as happening in particular time periods. We see the main takeaways. Unfortunately, our hour is up. So I want to say thank you so much, Kathleen. This has been such a rich conversation. Everyone should read this book. It's fabulous. I highly recommend it. And I'm so grateful for you for joining us. And for all of you who've joined us today,
Thank
now
you.
that you've joined, you're on the list for future book clubs. So please join the Roosevelt Institute as we discuss other great research in the months to come. Thank you so much, Kathleen.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining.
All right, everyone. Have a great afternoon.